the FDA has been around for 110 years, and we're still trying to figure out what their role should be, how strictly they should oversee the approval process for safety and effectiveness of both drugs and medical devices. This issue came up again this past week with the release of the GAO report on a medical device called power morcellators. And this has to do with laparoscopic surgery. And over the past 15 or 20 years, we've figured out how to do pretty major surgeries through these very, very small scopes and surgical instruments that are smaller than your fingers. So the patient has very small incisions, can recover more quickly. The problem comes up, though, one of the challenges we've faced with this is, what do you do when you have to take a piece of tissue out that's larger than our scope or our surgical instrument? Say you have something that's the size of an orange, maybe it's a gallbladder, maybe it's a uterine fibroid. What do you do then? So we invented these power morcellators, and this is a surgical instrument that can fit through the port for the scope or other instrument and chop up this tissue. And you can catch it in a bag or suction it away as you chop it up. And, as long as the tissue is not infected, or as long as there's not a cancer in the tissue, then it's safe to do, okay? So these power morcellators, the very first one was approved in 1991, and since then we've had 25 power morcellators approved up through 2013, and then they stopped. Now, when a medical device like this is being approved, they don't have to do a full clinical trial like you would for a new drug, for example, as long as they can show that the device they want to introduce is substantially equivalent to a predicate device, which is a device that currently has FDA approval. So in 1991, this first power morcellator came on the market, and it was targeted at uterine fibroids. So it was an abdominal procedure that they wanted to use this instrument on. And as the report notes, the interesting thing was the 1991 predicate was for knee surgery, for grinding up tissue or in the knee, whether it's cartilage or whatever. But the FDA accepted this as a predicate device. We went on with 25 variations of these morcellators up until 2014, until there was a black box warning, okay? And to understand the story of the black box warning, let me tell you a little bit about uterine fibroids. So these are benign growths on a woman's uterus. Sometimes they can get very large, larger than an orange, and they can cause considerable pain and bleeding. Traditionally, it required an open abdominal procedure to remove the uterus. Large incision, extended recovery time, complications due to the incision. So there were a couple of surgical innovations. First of all was just taking the fibroid out, where you leave the uterus intact, you make an incision in the uterus and just take out the fibroid. And then the next step was doing them through a scope. But how do you get the fibroid out of the abdomen? If you have a fibroid as big as an orange, how do you take it out? Well, you use a power morcellator, and you can remove the fibroid from the uterus and then use this morcellator to kind of chop it up and suction up the pieces or remove them in a bag. And this is fine as long as the woman does not have uterine cancer, because this can be messy. Sometimes you spill some tissue and into the open abdomen, and if there's a cancer, well, that's bad news, because you just spread the cancer through her abdomen now. But the feeling was that, and having an undiagnosed uterine cancer when you're doing a fibroid procedure was 1 in 10,000. At least this is what we thought in 1991. 1 in 10,000, hardly ever going to happen, so it's not really a major concern. And this is what women were told when they signed the consent to use the power morcellator in their surgery. This brings us to the story, the tragic story of Amy Reed, who is a physician that lives and works in the Philadelphia area, and had very uncomfortable uterine fibroids, had them removed at a prestigious Boston hospital, and they used a power morcellator, and indeed she had an undiagnosed uterine cancer. And it has spread through her abdomen. It's a very aggressive tumor, as these typically are, a leiomyosarcoma. And so she's got quite a problem. So she and her husband is a cardiac surgeon, and they've banded together and started this crusade, and they've been able to spread the word, which led to the GAO report. So, and this is the report that was released last week. Now, the report does not draw a conclusion. This is an investigative report. But what are some of the things that they note in the report? The first thing is that the FDA, when they approved, and this is not the fault of the FDA, they didn't have a misunderstanding. This was the conventional established wisdom that the rate of undiagnosed leiomyosarcoma was 1 in 10,000. It's actually, now we know it's much higher. It's actually about 1 in 350. They noted the use of predicates, and they noticed a couple of things. Like sometimes these predicates, these comparisons, are quite different. Like you're going to use an instrument in the abdomen with fibroids, and your predicate is an orthopedic device that you're using in the knee. They noticed that some of the other comparisons, there were some substantial gains. For example, the use of suction devices, that they still accepted variation in the predicates. And over time, as you have 25 introductions, they also pointed out that you get quite a bit of drift in these devices. One of the remarkable things is that the limitations of our post-market surveillance. When a drug or device is brought onto the market, providers and the company, as they become aware of complications, they're supposed to report them. And they probably do, but they don't really link one to the other. And this is a fairly obvious thing, that, gee, I took out a fibroid, and now this patient has disseminated leiomyosarcoma. So this should be something that we could detect, a safety signal that we can detect, but we weren't able to do it. Okay, so here's some things to think about. The FDA approval process. This makes the point that we can't know everything about a drug or device before it is released with objective certainty, with apodictic certitude. We just can't. There's tremendous limitations in our knowledge. So what should be our level of certainty about a drug? How important is it to acknowledge what we don't know about this drug as we release it to the market? And I'm not arguing that we need to have more investigative trials. In fact, I'm making the point that we just can't know everything. So what should the standard be in the face of this tremendous uncertainty? Specifically within the medical device approval process, the use of predicates is this an appropriate process? The GAO was describing a system where a system of predicates was not always applied appropriately. So what should it be? Every time we want to introduce a slight improvement in a medical device, do we really have to go through all these clinical trials if it's essentially the same thing? Or do we need more research? And the main conclusion that they note is that the adverse event reporting is not working. Here we had a safety signal, an obvious safety signal, where it was easy to make the link between use of this device and the disseminated cancer, and yet we could not detect this safety signal that was a magnitude of 9 times of what we thought the signal should be. So, what do we need to do about adverse event reporting? So I think we need to think about this. What are your thoughts about this? What should we be doing based on this GAO report about the FDA approval process?